Thomas Ashby was 24. He'd been home from France 8 days. The Argonne medal still rode loose in his coat pocket, wrapped in a handkerchief, unpinned. And on the church steps, in front of God and 40 neighbors, Gideon Marsh folded a foreclosure notice into his welcome home handshake. Tom didn't raise his voice. He read it once. Then he read it twice. Marsh was president of the Cedar County Guaranty Bank. He smiled when he said it. "The war's over, son. The bank was never a charity." $740, 30 days. The note his dead father had bled to keep. So that Monday, I walked to the county clerk's office, carrying one page the bank had never once bothered to read. If you believe quiet people read the fine print, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one find you, do me a small thing. Subscribe and comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let me tell it right. From the beginning. Thomas Ashby was born on the Cedar Bottomland in Marin County, Nebraska. In the spring, the river came up over the low field. His mother always said that. Born the year of high water. She said it like it meant something, and maybe it did. The river gave, and the river took, and a man who farmed the bottom learned both in the same season. The Ashby place was a quarter section, 160 acres. Most of it good black dirt down toward the water, and a strip of high ground where the house stood and where later the graves would go. His father was Ephraim Ashby, a big-shouldered, quiet man who coughed in the winters. Ephraim had proved that land the hard way. He'd bought it green and stumped it himself. He'd pulled cottonwood roots with a team and a chain until the horses lathered and his own hands split. Tom remembered that. He remembered being small and watching his father's back move under a wet shirt and the roots coming up out of the ground like something being born. Ephraim broke his back on that land. And in the end, he broke his lungs, too. There was a mortgage on the place. There nearly always was. In those years, a farmer carried paper the way he carried a limp, quietly and forever. But Ephraim was proud about it. He paid it in his own hand. He kept a ledger. A worn thing. Brown leather gone soft at the corners, the spine cracked white. And every payment he ever made on that note, he entered himself. The date. The amount. His own small, careful letters pressed hard into the page. He didn't trust the bank's book. He kept his own. Tom used to watch him do it at the kitchen table. Lamp turned up. Pen scratching. His father licking his thumb to turn the page. Every fall, after the corn went in and the check came back, Ephraim would sit down and make his entry and say the same words. "That's ours a little more. That's ours a little more." Tom carried that a long way, farther than his father ever knew. In the spring of 1917, the country went to war, and Tom went with it. He was 22. He didn't have to go. A farm boy could have stayed on the land and no one would have thought less of him. But something in him needed to. He never was good at explaining it. He just knew he'd hate himself if he sat the whole thing out on the bottom while other men crossed the water. His father didn't argue. That surprised Tom. Ephraim just looked at him a long moment across the barn lot and nodded and said, "The land'll keep," and went back to the harness he was mending. That was the last real thing his father ever said to him that mattered. The land'll keep. It turned out to be a harder promise than either of them knew. Tom shipped for France in the spring of 1918. He was a private in an infantry company, and then he was a corporal, and then he was in the Argonne, and I'll not walk you through that here. It's not that kind of story. Only know that he saw things a young man shouldn't and did things a young man shouldn't have to, and came out the far side of it alive, which is more than a lot of good men did. His mother wrote him. Cora Ashby. Once a week, sometimes more, in a hand that slanted uphill. Her letters were full of small things. The hens. A neighbor's new baby. A recipe she'd tried. The color the maples turned that fall. Her letters never once mentioned money. Not the price of corn, which had gone up in the war and then fallen out from under every farmer in the county like a trapdoor. Not the note. not the winter Ephraim took sick. She wrote him that his father had a cough, and then she wrote that his father was resting, and then, in a letter that reached him 3 weeks after it was true, she wrote that his father was gone. The influenza took Ephraim Ashby that winter. The same sickness that was killing men in the camps, in the trenches, and the cities, all of them at once, the whole world coughing. It came up the cedar bottom, and it took the biggest man Tom had ever known in 9 days. Tom read that letter standing up in a ruined French village with mud to his ankles. He read it, and he folded it, and he put it in his coat, and he went back to work, because there wasn't anything else a man could do with it over there. He grieved the way soldiers grieve, sideways and late, and mostly at night. What his mother didn't write, what she would not write, not to a son an ocean away who couldn't do a thing about it, was how she was carrying the note alone. Because that's what she was doing. Ephraim in the ground on the high strip of their own land, and Cora Ashby, 51 years old, keeping a 160-acre farm and a dead man's mortgage through the worst price collapse those bottoms had ever seen. Corn that had brought good money in the war years wasn't worth the hauling by the time the armistice came. And still the note came due. Notes don't grieve. Notes don't care that a man is dead or a boy is at war. They come due. She sold eggs. She sold butter. She sold a good heifer she'd meant to keep. She let the hired man go and did his work herself at 51, and she made the payments, and she did not tell her son. She wrote him about the maples. Now, on the boat home, and in the weeks before, there was one more thing that happened, and I want you to hold on to it, because it's going to matter more than anything. At the troop depot, waiting to muster out, Tom was standing in a line the way soldiers are always standing in lines. And a fellow next to him, an older man, a sergeant with a bad ear from the guns, was handing something around. A printed circular. Thin paper, folded in 3. "Take one," the sergeant said. "State's paying it. Soldier's bonus. $1.25 a day for every day you were in. Don't leave it lay." Tom took the circular the way you take anything a man presses on you in a line. Without much thought. He glanced at it. Adjusted compensation, it said, $1.25 a day. Payable to men who'd served, on their return, filed through the county. Tom folded it back up and put it in his coat, next to his mother's letters, and he said what a lot of proud young men said. "I didn't cross an ocean for a payout." The sergeant just looked at him. Older, and tireder, and wiser. "Sure you didn't, son," he said. "Keep it anyway." Tom kept it. He forgot about it. That circular sat in the lining of his coat, folded and soft, all the way across the Atlantic. He didn't think of it once. He thought about the bottomland. He thought about his mother alone. He thought about his father's grave he hadn't stood at yet. He did not think about $1.25 a day. Not yet. He came home in the fall of 1919. Off the train at the Marin Depot with a duffel on his shoulder and the medal in his pocket. And his mother waiting on the platform in her good coat, smaller than he remembered, gray come into her hair that hadn't been there when he left. She didn't cry. That wasn't her way. She put both hands flat on his chest like she was checking he was real. And she said, "You're thin." And that was Cora Ashby saying she'd been afraid every night for 18 months. They drove out to the bottom in a borrowed wagon. And Tom saw the land again for the first time, and it was fall, and the corn was cut, and the river ran low and brown at the edge of the low field, and his father's grave was up on the high strip, with a fresh stone he'd never seen. He stood there a while. His mother left him to it. It was that first week home, in the evenings, that the truth started coming out of her. Not all at once. Cora Ashby didn't spill. It came in pieces, over the supper table in the lamplight, the same lamp his father used to turn up for the ledger. The first piece cut him worse than he let her see. She told him, offhand, almost, reaching to trim the wick, about a day the winter before. Deep in the cold, right around when Ephraim was failing. A payment had come due on the note. And she'd been $12 short. $12. She'd sold what she could and scraped what she could, and she was $12 short of it, and she'd driven into town, into the Cedar County Guaranty Bank, to ask for a little grace. A week. 2. Her husband dying in the back bedroom and her only son in France. She'd stood at the teller's window in her good coat and asked for grace. And a clerk, she didn't even name him. She'd never forgotten the shrug, but she'd let go of the face. A clerk had looked at the note, and looked at her, and shrugged. Not cruel, even, worse than cruel, bored. As if a widow $12 short in the dead of winter was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was. That was the thing, it was ordinary. He'd told her the payment was the payment, and grace wasn't the bank's business, and was there anything else? She'd gone home and sold the parlor clock her mother had left her, and made up the $12 and made the payment on time. She told Tom this like it was nothing, like it was just how the world went. She'd written the bank a letter too, after asking, in writing, for the grace that was supposed to be due a soldier's family in wartime. There were provisions, everyone said, protections for men in service and the folks they'd left behind. She'd written it out careful and mailed it to Gideon Marsh himself. No one ever answered it. Not a line. Tom sat at that table and listened to his mother tell it plain, and he felt something start to turn over in his chest, slow and cold, like the river under ice. He didn't say much. He was learning already that in this family the anger went underground and ran there a long time before it came up. That was the first offense. The small one. The private one. A shrug at a window, a letter unanswered. You could hardly call it a crime. That's how it works, though, isn't it? It never starts as a crime. It starts as a shrug. The second time, Tom saw it with his own eyes. It was maybe a week later. A fine, cold, bright afternoon. Tom was out at the barn splitting stove wood when an automobile came up the section road, trailing dust, and turned in at the Ashby gate. A good car. A banker's car. Gideon Marsh got out of it. Tom knew him by sight the way everyone in the county did. A heavy, well-fed man of maybe 60, in a town suit, with a gold chain across his vest and a way of looking at things, at land, at stock, at people, like he was pricing them. He came up the lane not to the house but toward the barn lot, and he stepped up onto the porch of the machine shed like he owned the boards, and maybe in his mind he did. There was a young fellow with him. 19. Maybe 20. Thin, mild-looking, in a clerk's collar too big for his neck. He hung back by the car. That was Homer Peel, the bank's junior clerk, though Tom didn't know his name yet. Hold on to him, too. He matters. Marsh didn't shake Tom's hand. He looked around the place first, turned a slow circle on the porch of the shed, and looked out over the bottom, over the black dirt sloping down to the river. And Tom watched him price it. Good ground, Marsh said. Best bottom in the county, some say. Your father never did much with it, though, did he? He said it easy. Conversational, like remarking on the weather. Ephraim was a worker, I'll give him that. But a poor manager. A poor manager. Carried more paper than the land could throw off. Sentimental about it. Men get sentimental about dirt. He was standing 40 feet from where Ephraim Ashby lay in the ground, saying it. Tom set the axe down. Careful, head down in the block. He didn't trust his hands with it just then. Now you, Marsh went on, and turned to look at Tom, and there was a thing behind his eyes that Tom would come to know well. Appetite, you're a young man, back from the war. No sense chaining yourself to your daddy's mistakes. A place like this, flat, good drainage, close to the grade, there's men would pay real money for a right-of-way through here. A rail spur, say, he nodded down the bottom, tracing a line only he could see. A man could walk away from a bad note with cash in his pocket and start clean. Think on it, son. No shame in it. He was eyeing the bottomland aloud. For Frayne. Tom didn't know that name yet either, but he knew the look. A speculator wanted this ground, and Marsh was the door. Homer Peel stood by the car and heard every word of it. Marsh calling a dead man a poor manager on his own porch. And Homer said nothing. He looked at his shoes. He was young, and the bank was his living, and he said nothing. But something moved in the boy's face. Tom saw it, even then. A flinch. The clerk had a conscience, and it was uncomfortable in there. Marsh got back in his car and drove off in his dust, and Tom stood in the barn lot a long while with the cold coming down and the axe in the block, and did not pick it up again that day. That was the second offense. Bigger, a man on the porch. A dead father mocked. The bottomland measured for another man's rail line, right out loud, with one witness who kept his mouth shut. The rule of these things is 3. You know that if you've lived. Private, then witnessed, then public. It builds. It always builds, because the man doing it is testing how much the quiet ones will take, and every time you take it, he learns he can take more. The third time was the church steps. It was a Sunday. The whole neighborhood was there. It was Tom's first Sunday back in the pew where he'd sat as a boy, his mother beside him in her good coat. And it should have been a fine morning. It was a fine morning. After the service, the congregation stood out on the church steps in the cold sun, the way country people do, in no hurry, visiting. Men shaking Tom's hand. "Welcome home. Good to see you, son. Your daddy'd be proud." 40-odd neighbors, all of them glad, all of them meaning it. And Gideon Marsh came through that crowd with his hand out and his banker's smile on. And he took Tom's hand in both of his in front of everyone, warm as a friend. And he pressed a folded paper into it as he shook. "Welcome home, Thomas," he said loud enough. "Welcome home." Tom stood there with the man pumping his hand and the paper crushed between their palms, and something in him already knew. He got his hand back. He unfolded the paper. It was a notice, on the bank's letterhead. Cold, printed words and a figure filled in by hand. The note was called, "Payment in Full, $740, 30 days, or the bank would take the land to sale." The crowd had gone quiet the way a crowd does when it senses something without knowing what. 40 neighbors, watching, Cora Ashby a step behind her son, her face going white. Tom read it once. He read it twice. He read it a third time, and the words didn't change, and the sun stayed bright. And 40 people watched a soldier read a foreclosure notice on the steps of his own church 8 days after he came home from the war. He didn't raise his voice. I told you that at the start, and I'll tell you again, because it's the whole man in one line. He did not raise his voice. He looked up at Marsh, and he said, "Quiet. My father paid on this note for 11 years. And Marsh, smiling still, but the smile gone hard at the edges now that he had his audience, Marsh said the words that half the county would repeat for a year. "The war's over, son. The bank was never a charity. 740. 30 days. He patted Tom on the shoulder, patted him, and settled his hat, and walked down through the parting crowd to his car, like a man who'd done a piece of ordinary business and was ready for his dinner. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then old men started finding their hats, and women took their children's hands, and the crowd came apart the way crowds do around another man's shame, everybody suddenly needing to be somewhere. A few gripped Tom's arm as they went. Didn't say much. There wasn't much to say. Cora Ashby stood very straight beside her son the whole way to the wagon and did not let a single soul see her cry, and Tom loved her so much in that moment he could hardly breathe. They drove home in silence. The notice on the seat between them. That night, Tom lit the lamp at the kitchen table. His father's lamp. And he got down his father's ledger from the shelf where his mother kept it. And he opened it. He went through it page by page, 11 years of it, every payment in Ephraim's own careful hand, the date, the amount, pressed hard into the paper. That's ours a little more. He read them all, the whole slow record of a man buying his own ground back from the bank one corn crop at a time, and he came at last to the final page. The last entry was in his father's hand. A payment. made the fall before Ephraim took sick. And below it, nothing, a blank line where the next entry should have gone. The line his father never lived to fill. Still owed. Right there in the blank. The note his dead father bled to keep, unfinished, in the man's own writing. Tom sat with that a long time. And I want to tell you what he felt was rage. And there was rage in it. But mostly, that night, it was grief with nowhere to go. His father had trusted the land to keep. And a fat man in a town suit was going to sell it out from under a dead man's grave for another man's railroad, and there did not seem to be one thing on God's earth that Thomas Ashby could do about it. There did not seem to be. That was Sunday. The next days were bad. I'll not dress them up. Tom went around the place doing sums that wouldn't come out. $740 in 30 days in the fall of 1919 on a Nebraska bottom farm with corn not worth hauling. It was the moon. He might as well have been told to bring back the moon. He thought about selling the team. Good horses, his father's horses, and even they wouldn't bring a fraction of it. And a farm with no team was no farm at all. He thought about it anyway. That's how far down it had pushed him, a man doing the arithmetic of selling the very thing he needed to survive, just to buy a few more weeks on ground he was going to lose regardless. And then the speculator came sniffing. Delbert Frayne, a narrow, quick-eyed man who showed up at the gate 2 days after the church steps. Word travels with an offer for the bottomland. Cash, right now. Enough to clear the note and leave a little over, he said, generous as anything, saving you the shame of the auction, doing you a kindness. It was robbery, and both of them knew it. Pennies on the dollar for the best bottom in the county, because Frayne wanted the flat run of it for a rail spur and figured a desperate soldier would take any hand that reached down into the hole. Tom stood at his own gate and looked at Delbert Frayne's soft hands and told him no. Not yet. Told him to come back in 30 days if he was still so keen. Frayne smiled and touched his hat and said he'd do just that. He seemed sure how it would go. Everyone seemed sure how it would go. It was into this, Tom about at the bottom, the sums not coming out, the vultures circling, that a small, mild figure came up the Ashby lane on foot, late in the dusk, with his collar turned up so as not to be known. Homer Peel, the bank's junior clerk. The boy who'd stood by the car and said nothing while Marsh mocked a dead man. He'd walked out from town. 3 miles. He stood in the barn lot twisting his hat and he could hardly get the words out, he was so ashamed. And what he'd come to say, and what he'd come to give, was the thing that turned this whole story over. "Mr. Ashby," he said, "I got no business here. I'll likely lose my place for it. But I stood on your porch and heard what he said about your father, and I've not slept right since." He swallowed. "There's 2 things the bank's counting on you not knowing. And I can't stand under it anymore." He reached inside his coat and brought out a paper, folded in 3, thin and worn, and Tom felt the ground shift, because he had one just like it in the lining of his own army coat. Forgotten, uncrossed, an ocean carried and never once thought of. The soldier's bonus circular. "The state's paying it," Homer said, quick and low, the words coming easier now he was into them. "Adjusted compensation. $1.25 a day, every day you served, from muster to discharge. You file it through the county, and the Treasury certifies a warrant. It's yours. It's owed. It's not charity, Mr. Ashby, it's paid work. The country counting what you gave it." He was almost pleading now that Tom would understand. "How many days were you in?" And Tom, standing in his own barn lot in the dusk, did the sum he'd been refusing to do all week, but a different sum this time. He counted his service, muster to discharge, the training camp, the crossing, France, the Argonne, the long wait to come home. He counted the days, 630 days. Homer was already doing it in his head, his lips moving. $1.25 times 630. That's, he stopped, his eyes came up. That's $787.50. The barn lot went very quiet. Somewhere a horse shifted its feet. $787.50. The note was $740. It cleared it. It cleared the whole thing, the entire note his father died owing, and left $47.50 over. Tom stood there and could not, for a moment, make himself believe it. The moon he'd been told to bring back had been folded in the lining of his own coat since the troop depot. In a paper, a tired sergeant had pressed on him in a line while he said, "Proud and young and foolish, I didn't cross an ocean for a payout." But Homer wasn't done. He said the second thing. And the second thing was, if anything, bigger, "There's more. Mr. Ashby." And this is the part I don't think Mr. Marsh has read at all. He lowered his voice even though there was no one for a mile. "There's a law. Come out of the war. The Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief, it protects men in service, their debts, their property. A note like yours, on a man who was overseas, they couldn't lawfully move on it while you were in the service, nor for a window after you came home. And the fees, the penalties, whatever he's piled on top of that $740, a good deal of that he'd no right to levy on a returned soldier at all." Homer's hands were shaking now. "He called your note the very week you got home, Mr. Ashby, in front of the whole church. And I don't believe the man ever once read the statute that makes it unlawful. He's never had to read it. Nobody's ever made him. 2 pages. 2 pages the Cedar County Guaranty Bank had never bothered to read. One that put $787.50 of government-backed claim in the hand of a poor farm boy. And one that made the whole cruel thing on the church steps against the law." Tom Ashby stood in the dusk holding that thin-worn circular, and I'll tell you the truth of what happened in him, because it's the heart of the whole man. His first feeling was not triumph. His first feeling, God help him, was that same old pride rising up sour in his throat, the same pride that had made him say, "I didn't cross an ocean for a payout." A part of him wanted to hand the circular back. Take a bonus? Take relief? Like a beggar? Like his mother at the window asking grace? The Ashbys paid their own way. His father had paid it in his own hand. The blind spot that nearly cost him everything. He came that close to refusing the one thing that could save the land. It was Homer, mild Homer, who said the thing that turned him. "Mr. Ashby, it's not charity. You earned it a day at a time. Over there, in the mud, the same as your father earned this ground a crop at a time. The country wrote it down. Every day. It's yours the way the land is yours." He pressed the circular into Tom's hand and closed the fingers over it, the way Marsh had pressed the notice. Only the exact opposite of that. The exact holy opposite. Let it save the place. That's what it's for. And Tom, after a long moment, put the circular in his pocket and nodded. And that nod was the turn of the whole story, though nobody heard it but a horse and a nervous boy in the dark. "Thank you," Tom said. "It came out rough. You lose your place over this, Homer Peel. You'll always have work on this farm. You understand me?" Homer Peel walked the 3 miles back to town in the dark with a lighter heart than he'd carried out, and Tom Ashby went into the house where his mother sat with the ledger open under the lamp, and for the first time in 8 days he had something to lay on that blank line besides grief. Now, a lesser man, or an angrier one, might have simply gone and filed his claim quiet, and let Marsh find out at the auction, and enjoyed the man's face. Tom thought about it. But he was his father's son, and Ephraim had kept his own ledger because he did things in the open, in his own hand, where they could be checked. So Tom did it the hard way, the honest way, the way that would matter later more than he knew. He drove to the county seat. He went to the office of the county register, the same office where deeds and notes and every solemn paper in Marin County was recorded and witnessed. And he had the register draw up a notice, formal, dated, and witnessed under the man's own hand and seal. The notice stated, plain that Thomas Ashby intended to satisfy the note against his land in full. Within the 30 days Gideon Marsh had allowed, by means of his soldier's compensation warrant then being filed with the state. And it warned the Cedar County Guaranty Bank, formally and on the record, against selling or contracting to sell that land to any party in the meantime. Witnessed, dated. On the record. In the open. Then Tom took a copy of that witnessed notice, and he drove to the bank, and he laid it on Gideon Marsh's desk himself. Marsh read it. Tom watched him read it. And the man did not go pale, and he did not go quiet. He laughed. He leaned back in his chair and he laughed, an easy, fat, comfortable laugh, and he held the paper up and looked at it like it was a child's drawing. "A soldier's bonus," he said. "A circular." He shook his head, delighted. "Son, I've had farm boys promise me the moon before. You've got 30 days. You come in here with money, real money, cash on this desk, and we'll talk. But a circular and a promise?" He set the notice aside, on the corner where the day's trash went. "The land's as good as sold. You'd be smarter to take Frain's offer and keep the difference. This," he flicked the witness notice with one finger, "this is nothing. A farm boy and a circular." He never read it. That was the thing Tom saw, standing there. Marsh looked at the words and never once read what they meant. He'd never had to read a thing in his life. Nobody had ever made him. Tom didn't argue. He'd learned that in France, too, you don't argue with the shelling, you just do your work and let it come. He picked up his hat. At the door he stopped and turned and said one quiet thing, and it wasn't a threat, which is what made it land. "You'll want to read that, Mr. Marsh, all of it. There's a second page." And he left. Behind him, Gideon Marsh did not read the second page. He had a sale to arrange with Delbert Ephraim, and a rail spur to bring to Marin County, and the arrogance of a man who had never in his life been made to turn to the last line of anything. That's the mistake this whole story turns on. He was warned. Witnessed and dated, he was warned. And he laughed, and he did not read the page. The next morning, Tom Ashby drove back to the county seat with everything he owned that mattered on paper. His honorable discharge, his service record, every day of it accounted for, the circular. And he sat down across from the county register, and he filed it all, lodged his claim for the soldier's compensation, entered his discharge into the record, and set the application for the warrant moving up the line to the state treasury. The clerk copied it into the book in a slow, steady hand. Signed, sealed, dated, and with that stroke of the pen, the thing was done that couldn't be undone. The paper trail had begun. The claim was in the record. The warrant was applied for and would come, certified, government-backed. $787.50 down through the state treasury and into the hands of the county register, who could pay it out on the spot. All of it moving now. All of it real. All of it on the record, in the open, in his father's honest way. There was just the one thing left that Tom Ashby could not control, standing there watching the register blot the ink. The one thing between him and the land. The warrant had to come. Through the mail. In time. And Gideon Marsh had already set the auction. Now, a warrant in the mail is a strange kind of thing to hang a farm on. You can't see it. You can't touch it. It's a promise moving down a line of clerks and rail cars and canvas sacks. And every one of those hands is a hand that could set it down and forget it. Tom knew that. He'd learned in France how far a paper could travel and how easy it was to lose. So he did the only thing a farming man knows to do with a worry. He worked. He mended the fence along the North 40. He greased the wagon. He turned the milk cow out to the good grass and watched her put on flesh. And every afternoon, when the mail rider came up the county road in his dust, Tom straightened up from whatever he was doing and watched him pass. The rider passed. Day after day, he passed. Meanwhile, in town, Gideon Marsh was a busy man. He had convinced himself of a comfortable thing. He had told himself that Tom Ashby was bluffing. A farm boy and a printed circular. A story cooked up out of desperation, the kind desperate men always cooked up when the note came due. Marsh had seen 100 of them. They wept, or they threatened, or they went quiet and clever like this one. And in the end, the land always came to the bank all the same. So he set the auction. He set it for the courthouse steps on the morning of the 30th day. And he set a private thing behind the public one. He met Delbert Ephraim at the hotel, and over a good dinner the two men shook hands on the bottomland. Ephraim would take it the day it fell, and the rail spur would run straight through the Cedar Bottom, and Marin County would have its depot, and Gideon Marsh would have the thanks of every merchant in town. And the boy? Ephraim asked. He was a narrow man with quick eyes that never quite lit on anything. He'll make no trouble? He'll make noise, Marsh said. They always make noise. Noise doesn't pay a note. Ephraim smiled his narrow smile, and the thing was arranged. Now here is where the story holds its breath. Because the warrant was coming. It was real, and it was certified, and it was moving. But it was moving slow, the way government things move, and the days were burning off the calendar one by one, and there was not a soul in Marin County who could make the mail come faster. The first bad morning came on the 22nd day. Cora Ashby was at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her. That brown leather book. Her husband's book. She had it open to the last page, to Ephraim's own hand, the last payment he ever entered before the fever took him. And below it, the blank line. The line still owed. Her hands were shaking over it. It should have come by now, she said. She didn't look up. Tom, it should have come. It'll come, Ma, you said a week. It's been more than a week. Tom set his coffee down. He came around the table and he put his hand over both of hers, and hers were cold and thin and trembling, the hands of a woman who had carried something too heavy for too long alone. I'll go to town, he said. I'll ask the register. Right now this morning. I'll go and I'll ask. He hitched the team and he drove the 3 miles in under an hour, faster than was kind to the horses. And he stood at the county register's counter with his hat in his hands, and he asked the question that had been eating him. The register was an older man, careful, slow-spoken. He went to his book. He turned the pages. He ran one finger down a column, and then he stopped, and he looked up over his spectacles. It's certified, son, he said. Came through the Treasury office. It's on its way down to me now. It's real, and it's coming, and when it lands in this office, I can pay it out to you across this counter. You have my word on it. Tom stood there a moment. Something loosened in his chest that had been wound tight for days. How long, he said. Days, a handful of days. No more. The register set down his pen. You hold steady, Thomas Ashby. Your father was an honest man, and this is honest paper. It'll be here. Tom drove home slower. He told his mother, and he watched the fear go out of her face. And for one evening the little house on the bottomland was quiet in a good way. But a handful of days was cutting it thin. And the auction was set. And Marsh was not idle. The second bad turn came from Delbert Ephraim. He drove out to the farm himself, the day was the 28th, in a shining buggy that had never seen a hard day's work. He didn't get down. He sat up on his seat and he looked over the bottomland the way a butcher looks at a steer, and he called Tom over with 2 fingers like he was calling a dog. Tom came, slow, and stood by the wheel. Ashby, Ephraim said, I'll make this easy on you. The auction's day after tomorrow. You know how these things go. The land sells for a song, the bank takes its cut, you walk away with nothing and a debt still hanging. Or, he tapped a leather wallet against his knee. Or I give you cash today. Right now. Enough to clear your note and put a little in your pocket, and you sign the deed over to me. And you're free of the whole business. No auction. No shame in front of the town. Clean. It was a lowball. Tom knew it was a lowball. It was a fraction of what the bottomland was worth, dressed up to look like mercy. And for 1 second, he'd admit this later, for 1 second the tiredness in him wanted to take it. To just be done. To not stand on that courthouse step and gamble the whole farm on a canvas sack of mail. Then he thought of his father's hand in that ledger. 630 entries a man could make, and never one of them a lie. "No," Tom said. Ephraim blinked. "No? You heard me. The land's not for sale to you. Not today, not at auction, not ever if I can help it." Tom stepped back from the wheel. "Drive on, Mr. Ephraim. You're standing on ground my father broke with his own back, and you never asked to." Ephraim's quick eyes went flat and mean. "You're a fool, boy, maybe. Drive on." And he did, in a spray of dust, back toward town to tell Gideon Marsh that the boy wouldn't be moved. Which was the one thing Marsh didn't want to hear, though he'd never say so. Now here's the thing Marsh had done, the thing that was going to break over him like a wave, and he didn't even know the water was rising. He had never read the second page. Remember that? On the church steps, and again in his office, Tom had put it in front of him. Homer Peel had come 3 miles through the dark to make sure Tom understood it. And Tom had understood it. But Marsh had looked at a farm boy and a printed circular, and he had laughed and set the paper on the corner of his desk unread. 2 things were written on pages Gideon Marsh never turned to. The first was the warrant itself. The soldier's compensation. $1.25 a day for every day Thomas Ashby wore the uniform of his country. 630 days. $787.50. Certified by the state, honored by the county treasury, payable across the register's own counter. More than enough to clear a $740 note, with change to spare. And the second thing was worse for Marsh. Much worse. The Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act. It was a law the country had passed in 1918, while men like Tom were still in the trenches. And what it said, in plain terms, was this. You could not move against a soldier's home while he was away serving. You could not foreclose on him. You could not pile on penalties, and for a stretch of time after he came home, that protection held. Which meant that when Gideon Marsh stood on those church steps 8 days after Tom's boots touched American soil and folded that called note notice into a returning soldier's handshake, Marsh wasn't just being cruel. He was breaking the law. Every penalty he'd added. Every fee he'd stacked onto the note while the soldier's family scraped and went $12 short and sold a dead mother's parlor clock to keep the roof, every cent of that was levied against a protected man, in violation of a federal act, and it would not stand. Marsh never knew it. He'd had the whole thing in his hand and set it on the corner of his desk. And that, right there, is the hinge the story turns on. Not the warrant alone, the 2 pages together. The one he read wrong, and the one he never read at all. The word got around the county the way word does. Slow. And then, all at once. At the feed store and the church and over back fences, the neighbors heard it. The Ashby boy, home from France, robbed the week he got home. The bank selling his father's bottomland out from under him. And the boy holding a soldier's warrant that would clear the whole thing, if only the mail would come in time. 40-odd families had stood on those church steps and watched Marsh do it. And a fair number of them had notes of their own at the Cedar County Guaranty Bank and had felt Gideon Marsh's particular kindness firsthand. So they talked. And out of the talking came a plain rural decision, the kind that doesn't get announced, just done. They would go to the courthouse. On auction morning. All of them. If Marsh means to sell that boy's land, said one old man at the feed store, loud enough for the whole room, he can do it looking at every one of us. And the day before the auction, the 29th day, the warrant still had not come. Tom went to town that morning and stood at the register's counter, and the register turned his book and shook his head, slow and sorry. Not yet, son, it's tomorrow. Tom's voice was steady, but it cost him. The auction's tomorrow morning. If it's not in your hand by then, I know it. Then what do I do? The register took off his spectacles. He was quiet a moment. You come to that courthouse tomorrow with everything you've got. Your discharge. Your claim, filed and recorded, in my own book. the circular. And you stand up, and you say your piece, and you tell the truth in front of the whole county. Paper like this doesn't vanish, Thomas. It's certified. If it's a day late, it's still owed to you, and a sale made against a claim like this one. He tapped the counter. That's a sale a court will look at hard. You hear me? You are not without ground to stand on. Not by a long way. But you come. And you bring it all. Tom drove home in the dark. His mother was waiting at the window with a lamp. He didn't have to say it. She read it on his face. She didn't weep. She'd done all her weeping years ago, alone, over a ledger. $12 short in the dead of winter. She just took the lamp and set it down and put her hand flat on the brown leather book on the shelf. Your father paid on this land 630 ways, she said. Isn't it a strange thing? 630 payments he made. And 630 days you served. As if the two of you were keeping the same book, on opposite sides of the ocean, and neither one knowing it. Tom looked at her. Come to the courthouse, Ma, he said. Whatever happens, come and stand with me. I never thought otherwise, she said. Auction morning came up clear and gold over the cedar bottom. Tom was awake before the light. He put on his good shirt. And then he did a thing he hadn't done since France. He took the little handkerchief from his coat pocket, and he unwrapped the Argonne medal, and he looked at it a long moment. He didn't pin it on. He wrapped it again and slid it back in the coat, over his heart, where it had ridden home across an ocean. Then he took his father's ledger under his arm, and his discharge, and his service record, and the circular, and he hitched the team, and he and his mother drove the 3 miles to town. And when they came up over the last rise and the courthouse square came into view, Tom Ashby pulled the horses up short. Because the square was full of wagons, full of them. Ringing the courthouse on every side, teams and buckboards and old farm rigs. And standing among them in their Sunday clothes were the neighbors. 40 of them. More than 40. The same faces that had stood on the church steps and watched him robbed, come now to stand and watch what happened next. They'd come. Every one of them had come. Tom's throat closed up. His mother put her hand on his arm. Drive on, son, she said softly. They're waiting on you. He drove into the square, and the neighbors made a lane for the wagon, and not a one of them said a loud word. They just nodded to him as he passed. Grave and quiet, and with him. On the courthouse steps stood Gideon Marsh in his good black coat, with a paper in his hand and the auctioneer beside him. And a little behind Marsh, narrow and quick-eyed, stood Delbert Frayne, with his leather wallet and his shining buggy waiting, and off to the side, apart, in the plain clothes of a bank clerk, stood a 19-year-old boy named Homer Peel. He'd come too. He didn't have to. He'd come to see it through. Marsh watched the wagons ring his auction, and his face tightened, just a little, at the corners. But he was Gideon Marsh. He had never in his life been made to turn to the last line of anything. He lifted the paper, and he began. By authority of the Cedar County Guaranty Bank, he read out, and default upon the note held against the property known as the Ashby quarter section, 160 acres of cedar bottomland. This property is offered at public sale this morning to satisfy the sum of $740, plus fees and penalties duly, not lawfully. The voice came from the crowd. It was Tom's. He was climbing down from the wagon with the ledger under his arm, and he came up through the lane the neighbors made, and he came up the courthouse steps, and he stood facing Gideon Marsh in the gold morning light. That sale's not lawful, Mr. Marsh, and I'll show you why. In front of everybody. The way you called the note in front of everybody. Marsh's jaw set. The note is in default. You've had 30 days. You've paid nothing. Step aside, Ashby, and let the law take its course. The law, Tom said. Yes, let's have the law. And he turned, not to Marsh but to the county register, who had come out onto the steps with his own book under his arm. And Tom asked him, plain and clear, so the whole square could hear, Sir, is there paper filed in your office, in your book? in my name, against this note." "There is," the register said. "Would you read it out?" The register opened his book, and in the clear morning over the heads of 40 neighbors, he read it. The claim. Filed and recorded. Thomas Ashby, discharged soldier, 630 days of service to the United States. A state compensation warrant, certified, in the sum of $787.50. Applied for through the Treasury. Payable, when it landed, across the register's own counter. A murmur went through the wagons. Marsh's voice came sharp. "When it landed." "It hasn't landed. There's no money here. There's a boy and a story and a book of promises, and none of it is $740 on this step this morning." The sale proceeds. And here, right here, is where the story would have broken the wrong way. Because Marsh was right about one thing. The warrant wasn't there. It was somewhere on a rail car or in a canvas sack, certified and real and too slow. And a sale is a sale. But the register wasn't finished. And neither was Tom. Because a wagon was coming up the county road. You could hear it before you could see it. The neighbors turned. Up the road at a hard clip came the mail rider's rig, and the mail rider standing up in it and waving his hat, and beside him on the seat, having ridden out at first light to meet the down train himself, was the register's own clerk with a canvas sack in his lap. The rig came into the square, the neighbors parted, and the clerk climbed down and came up the steps 2 at a time and put into the register's hands a long envelope, sealed and certified, stamped by the state treasury. The square went dead silent. The register broke the seal. He drew out the warrant. He read it, top to bottom, his lips moving. And then he looked up, and his voice, when it came, was steady and carrying, and it reached every wagon in the square. "This is the warrant. Certified. State of Nebraska. Payable to Thomas Ashby. $787.50. He looked at Marsh. "It's here, Mr. Marsh. It landed." This minute. Tom Ashby took the ledger from under his arm. His father's ledger. That brown leather book with 630 honest entries in a dead man's hand. He opened it, on the courthouse table, to the last page. To Ephraim's last entry, and the blank line below it. The line still owed. And then he took the warrant from the register's hand, and he laid it down. Right there, on the ledger's last unpaid line, $787.50 laid across a $740 debt his father had bled to carry and his mother had nearly died holding. Tom straightened up. He looked at Gideon Marsh. And when he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He'd read the notice twice on the church steps without raising his voice. And he did not raise it now. "You forgot to read the one page that mattered, Mr. Marsh, quiet carrying, the one my country wrote. It counted every day I gave it. 630 of them. $1.25 each. And it comes to more than you ever called against this land." He put one finger on the warrant. "You never counted on that. You looked at a farm boy and a circular, and you laughed, and you set the page on the corner of your desk. Well, here's the page. Read it now." Gideon Marsh's hand went still at his side. The register took up the warrant and the note together, and he did his office, out loud, for the county to hear. "The warrant is honored. The county treasury pays it out, here, across my counter, this morning. $740 applied to the note." He made a mark in his book. "The note is satisfied. In full." A sound went up from the wagons then. Not a cheer, exactly. Something deeper than a cheer. A kind of low glad rumble from 40 throats. The sound a hard people make when they see one of their own come through. But it wasn't over. There was a second page yet. The county attorney had come out onto the steps, a lean man with spectacles, who'd been sent for and who'd read the paper Tom filed. And he stepped forward now with a copy of the Soldiers and Sailors Civil Relief Act in his hand, and he addressed himself to Gideon Marsh in a dry, carrying courtroom voice. Mr. Marsh, this note was called against Thomas Ashby on the 14th, 8 days after his discharge and return from active service overseas. Are you aware of the federal statute passed in 1918 respecting the property of men in service? Marsh's mouth opened. Nothing came. I'll take that as no, the attorney said. Because if you had read it, and I'm told it was placed in your hand twice, you'd have known that you may not lawfully move against a serviceman's home during his service, nor for a protected period after his return, nor pile penalties upon him. This calling of the note, this morning's sale, and every fee you stacked onto it, he turned a page, are levied against a protected man, in violation of that act. They are void. I'll be advising the register to strike them. And I'll be advising this man that he stood, this whole 30 days, on a legal right you never troubled to read. The attorney lowered the paper. You added $47.50 in fees and penalties, Mr. Marsh, against a soldier's family. $12 short one winter, and this man's mother sold her own mother's clock to make your payment, and wrote you a letter asking for the grace this very law required you to give, and you never answered it. That letter's spoken of all over this county now. So is the clock. He let that sit in the quiet, and in the quiet you could hear Gideon Marsh's certainty coming apart. Marsh tried. You had to give him that much, he tried. The bank has an obligation to its depositors. The note was in arrears. I acted within. A banker cannot be expected to. Every note, every circumstance, and his justification died right there in the morning air. It just ran out. Because there was nothing under it. 40 neighbors looked at him and did not blink, and his words got smaller and smaller, and then they stopped, and Gideon Marsh stood on the courthouse steps he'd meant to sell a man's home from, with a voided sale in one hand and a broken law in the other. And nothing left to say. That's the sound a proud man makes when he's made, for once in his life, to turn to the last line. It's no sound at all. Delbert Frayne didn't wait for the end of it. Somewhere around the reading of the statute, the narrow man with the quick eyes understood that there would be no bottomland, and no rail spur through the cedar bottom, and no depot with his name spoken behind it. His whole scheme had hung on that 160 acres, and the acres were not going to fall. He turned his back at the top of the steps, he walked to his shining buggy. He climbed up, and he took the reins, and he drove out of the square without a word to anybody, through the lane of farm wagons, past 40 people who watched him go and were glad to see the dust of him. The rail spur went looking for another county after that. Frayne with it. And that was the last the Cedar Bottom saw of Delbert Frayne. Tom found Homer Peel in the crowd. The boy was standing apart, the way a bank clerk stands who has just watched his own bank humbled in the public square, and isn't sure whether he's about to be thanked or blamed. 19 years old. He'd walked 3 miles in the dark to press a circular into a stranger's hand, because it was the right thing, and it had cost him his easy place at the Cedar County Guaranty Bank, and he'd done it anyway. Tom came through the crowd, and he put out his hand. You walked 3 miles at night to give me a fighting chance, Tom said, when it would have been easier to say nothing. I don't forget that, Homer. Not ever. Homer took his hand and shook it, and the boy's eyes were wet, and he didn't try to hide it. My daddy was a soldier, Homer said, low, Spanish War. He came home to a bank, too. I couldn't stand there and watch it happen twice. Well, Tom said, it didn't happen. Because of you. And 40 neighbors saw the returning soldier shake the bank clerk's hand on the courthouse steps. And they understood exactly what it meant, and that was its own kind of verdict. Now, you'd think that was the end. The note paid, the fees struck, the villain silenced, the land saved. And it was the end of the worst of it. But there's one more thing you have to hear. Because it's the sweetest turn in the whole business. A few weeks went by. The corn came up green in the cedar bottom. And one warm evening, a buggy came up the Ashby lane. And out of it climbed Gideon Marsh, hat in his hand, not on his head, in his hand. Because here's the thing about that rail line. The county still wanted it. The merchants still wanted their depot. And when the surveyors sat down with their maps, they found what they'd always known, that the only sensible route for the spur ran across the corner of the Cedar bottomland. Tom's corner, the very ground the bank had tried to take. They needed a right-of-way, and to get it, somebody had to come up the Ashby lane and ask. They sent Marsh, maybe as a punishment. Maybe because the bank still held the paper on the merchants who wanted the depot. Either way, it was Gideon Marsh who climbed down at the gate, hat in hand, and stood at the bottom of the porch steps where Tom Ashby sat with his mother and a young woman named Ada Rayburn, who'd waited 3 years for him to come home from France and was on the porch most evenings now. Marsh cleared his throat. "Ashby, Miss Marsh?" "The rail line." Marsh turned his hat in his hands. "It needs to cross your northeast corner. There's no other route surveys out. The county's authorized me to, that is, to ask you. About a right-of-way. Terms to be discussed." Tom looked at him a long moment from the porch. He didn't gloat. That wasn't in him, and anyhow his father's ledger had taught him that a man's dignity is worth more when it costs him something to keep it. "I'll grant the right-of-way," Tom said. Marsh's shoulders eased. "On my terms," Tom said, "in writing. Fair market for the ground, paid to me, not a penny less than the county pays anybody. That's the first thing." He stood up from the porch. "And the second thing, the grace my mother asked you for, one winter, when she was $12 short and you never answered her letter. That grace, you'll put it back on the books. For every soldier's family that holds a note at that bank. The relief the law already owes them, that you never gave. You'll restore it. In writing. To all of them." The evening was quiet. Somewhere in the bottom a whip poor will start it up. "That's my price, Mr. Marsh," Tom said. "The rail can cross my corner. But the men your bank leaned on will get the grace they were always owed. Both, or neither." And Gideon Marsh, who had never in his life been made to turn to the last line of anything, stood at a farmer's gate with his hat in his hands and turned to it. "Agreed," he said. "In writing. All of it." "Then we'll get along," Tom said. And he did not shake the man's hand. Some things a country restores and some it doesn't. But he nodded, even, and Marsh put his hat back on and climbed into his buggy and drove back to town in the last of the light. The bank stayed open. It had to, on the terms the boy set. But Gideon Marsh did not stay long behind its counter. The board had read the papers he'd ignored. Once the county attorney laid it all before them, the broken statute, the public sale, the soldier robbed the week his boots hit home soil. There'd been a meeting in a closed room. No shouting. Just, at the end of it, the sound of a chair pushed back and Gideon Marsh gathering his coat. And walking out of the Cedar County Guaranty Bank for the last time. The bank stayed open. He did not. Now let me tell you how it looks, a year on. The Cedar bottomland is green clear to the river. Tom Ashby put it in corn that first full spring, and the river behaved itself, and the crop came in heavy and good. There's a milk cow in the little pasture by the barn. A good red cow with a white face, and if you want to know, she was bought with money that had a story to it. $787.50 the warrant was. 740 cleared the note. That left $47.50. And that $47.50 bought a milk cow, and there's a kind of justice in that too, that the last of a soldier's pay, after it saved the land, turned itself into milk and butter on a farm table. Ephraim's ledger sits on the shelf in the kitchen where it always sat. But it's closed now. Tom closed it. On the last unpaid line, below his father's final entry, in his own hand, he wrote 3 words, "Paid in full." His father's writing, and his own, one above the other, closing a book the two of them kept from opposite sides of an ocean and never knew it. The Argonne medal is on the wall now. Cora hung it there. Not up high, Not in a place of pride exactly, just at rest, in the kitchen, where the family eats. Where a man who crossed an ocean and came home and stood on a courthouse step and would not be moved can see it of an evening and know it counted. Every day of it counted. That was the whole thing, in the end. His country counted every day, and wrote it down, and honored it, and no bank on earth could call it back. Ada Rayburn is on the porch most evenings. She waited 3 years while he was in France, and she waited 30 more days while a warrant crawled through the mail, and she's done waiting now. There's talk of a wedding once the corn's in. Cora smiles when it's mentioned, which is a thing she does more of these days. As for the two who tried to take it all, Delbert Frayne, the rail went around us in the end. A longer route, a costlier one, but it never touched the Cedar bottom. The river never minded. And Frayne took his quick eyes to some other county, and nobody here has said his name in a year. And Gideon Marsh. Well, here's the whole of it, and I'll say it plain, the way my mother would. The bank stayed open. He did not. There's a lesson in it, if you want one, and it's an old one. Older than any of us. A proud man can hold every card and lose the hand, if he's too proud to turn to the last page. And a quiet man can lose everything on paper and win it all back, if the quiet man reads the fine print. What a country counts, no bank can call. That's the story of Thomas Ashby and his father's ledger, and the warrant that came up the county road one gold morning with the whole county watching. It happened on the Cedar Bottomland, in Marin County, on the good black dirt beside a Nebraska river. In the fall, the boys came home. If it moved you, if you know a family that bled for a piece of ground and held it, do me a kindness and comment the town you're watching from. I read every one. And I want to see just how far this story travels, from that little bottomland farm out to wherever you're sitting tonight.